Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're settling into a profound and, I think, a very quiet crisis, the modern inability to truly rest. We're exploring the tension between the structured quietude of former times and the pervasive anxiety of contemporary life.
There's a palpable stillness you read about that many of us can barely even imagine. We look back at the historical enforcement of blue laws, those Sunday closing laws that essentially mandated a pause on almost everything.
Exactly, and it wasn't just commercial activity that stopped. In some places like Belfast, I believe, until 1965, even recreational spaces, public playgrounds were padlocked. This wasn't just a law, it enforced a societal rhythm.
And that rhythm, that enforced rhythm, it dictated everything, even how we consumed content. I mean, when you consider the sheer weight of the hefty Sunday newspaper, it was this ritualistic object that required a huge chunk of the day just to absorb. There was no instant switch to something else when boredom set in.
And that structural stillness, that mandatory societal pause, that's central to our question today. We're dealing with what seems to be an epidemic of productivity guilt, this inability to rest without anxiety. So, is this guilt primarily a consequence of dissolving those strong historical, societal boundaries? Or is it fundamentally a function of our internal wiring? Our brains maladapting to this hyper-stimulating neoliberal digital age?
Right. I think you're framing this as an argument about causality. Where does the pressure really originate?
I will argue that the loss of mandatory external structures, those societal guardrails that protected us collectively from continuous motion, is the primary driver of this guilt. When society stopped enforcing quiet, the demands of the market simply, they just flooded into our personal domain.
And I'll argue the primary issue is internal. It's a neurochemical and cultural pressure for constant optimization. The anxiety isn't that the store is open. It's that we feel morally and existentially compelled to optimize every single waking moment, regardless of whether a store is open or closed.
Well, let's delve into that idea of structural defense. My core thesis is that the erosion of culturally mandatory days of rest, it stripped the individual of a collective defense mechanism against the relentless demands of the market. Historically, the legal purpose of Sunday closing laws was to provide a uniform day of rest for all citizens.
And while that was the Supreme Court's secular justification, the foundation was, of course, religious observance, which that often complicated its application and its eventual repeal.
True, but the effect was a secular one. It was a collective defense. This structural stillness, it created a mandatory void. Because commerce and communication and activity were halted, this absence, it fostered slower, more internal experiences. Think of waiting for the results of a game to crawl across Ceefax. That low-tech, excruciating wait forced you to engage your own thoughts. It cultivated what we now call productive boredom.
I appreciate the nostalgia for that forced slowness, I really do. But my contention is that the guilt we feel when resting it's fundamentally rooted in an internal, culturally enforced addiction to utility. If you look at modern society, time is just uniformly viewed as a scarce resource, which is the precursor to what psychologists now call leisure guilt.
And how does that shift from viewing time as cyclical or shared to viewing it as scarce? How does that drive this anxiety?
Well, because every moment of unutilized time represents a loss of potential utility, and this is driven by constant neurochemical reinforcement. We seek high dopamine stimulation all the time, compulsive social media checking, endless streaming, these instant gratification loops. This perpetual seeking, it just fatigues the brain, it fractures our attention span, and ultimately, it leads to mental exhaustion and burnout. The internal off switch, it isn't just sticky. For many people, it's structurally broken by overstimulation.
That points toward a biological failure. Sure, but how does the culture reinforce it?
Through the cultural expectation that we must always be useful. I mean, take the Dutch concept of Niksen. It translates literally as doing nothing without purpose. Even attempting this act of deliberate, quiet idleness is an internal struggle for most people. They feel guilty when they're trying to practice Niksen because they've internalized the cultural mandate to always be productive.
So the very act of relaxation becomes work.
Precisely. We transform genuine self-care into this oppressive ethical imperative. And this is the neoliberal mandate to be homo economicus, the economic man. The idea that the self is a continual project of optimization and value creation. The problem isn't the physical closure of a shop. It's the internal factory that never shuts down.
That brings us to our first major contention then. The efficacy of these old regulations in the face of today's infinite digital market.
And I believe they are. Well, they're largely obsolete. The deregulation of Sunday trading laws in many places occurred specifically for competitive reasons. Merchants feared losing trade to foreign companies or, areas without restrictions. Since online shopping allows consumers to just bypass blue laws instantly, such regulations now, they only punish physical brick-and-mortar businesses. The law simply cannot mandate quietude when the internet offers unparalleled access and instant gratification worldwide. The collective quiet you champion, it's functionally impossible to enforce in a globalized economy.
I disagree with the premise that functional unenforceability against global commerce equates to psychological irrelevance. Even if these laws are now functionally toothless against Amazon, the intent of that collective boundary provided crucial psychological protection.
But protection from what if the transactions happen anyway?
Protection from the overwhelming sense that you are the only one not participating. The systematic erosion of these laws, what some call the Swiss cheesing of blue laws, where exceptions just punched holes into the whole structure collapsed, it demonstrates a legislative failure to protect a day of rest, not the idea's irrelevance. The goal was never just stopping commerce, it was creating a social norm of cessation, a shared cultural agreement to slow down.
But if the social norm is now global, why would a local law change internal anxiety? We see this played out daily with the compulsion to check emails while traveling. The individual feels they have to engage in this covert productivity, suffering the anxiety that leads to work from vacation, or WFE, just to avoid the terror of personal failure and falling behind.
And why does that terror exist? Because the structure that provided a legitimate social excuse to stop has been removed. That structure inoculated us against the fear of missing out or the fear of appearing inadequate. Without a collective boundary, the individual is just left exposed, with no social script other than maximize output. The structural protection was the psychological defense against WFE.
That assumes the brain, even if protected externally, is still capable of truly resting in our current environment. Let's look at the science of boredom you mentioned. You argue the past forced the chance for true, creative boredom.
Absolutely. That forced downtime is scientifically proven to be a precursor for creative thinking. It allows the brain to enter the default mode network, the state where our most reflective, self-aware processing occurs. When people weren't constantly bombarded with external inputs, they were forced to generate internal meaning, fostering personal growth and self-awareness. It forced introspection.
I understand the importance of the DMN. I do. But the modern malaise is precisely an inability to tolerate the nothing required for productive reflection. Our constant exposure to intense digital stimulation has fundamentally altered the brain's chemical expectations.
How so?
Well, think of the baseline. When the brain is used to the intense, immediate rush of dopamine from a social media notification or a rapid-fire video stream, it begins to view simple, everyday tasks like sustained attention during deep work or quiet reflection as comparatively boring or difficult.
Right. It's like the brain has acquired an expectation for novelty that common life can no longer meet.
Exactly. We've raised the reward threshold to an unsustainable level. This mental fatigue means that even when structurally at rest, even if you mandate a quiet Sunday, the individual is internally restless, anxious, or suffering from the symptoms of chronic burnout. The solution cannot be external regulation. It has to address the brain's overloaded reward system directly.
But isn't asking someone suffering from chemically reinforced anxiety to simply self-regulate, isn't that an unfair shift of responsibility? If the source of the fatigue is ubiquitous and marketed to exploit our chemistry, how can individual moderation ever compete?
Because the stimuli are infinite. No law can stop the notification light on your phone from blinking across the Atlantic. We must learn to exercise self-control and establish self-imposed limits, recognizing that the battle is fought internally. We have to embrace the discipline of intentional moderation, or we will always be exhausted.
I am just not convinced by that line of reasoning because the very existence of historical structures was precisely to protect against such a pervasive individualizing ideology. If the problem is the cultural imperative to be homo economicus, continually optimizing and performing, then the blue laws were a collective recognition that human well-being requires enforced respite from that ideology.
But that cultural imperative runs deeper than just work hours. The core exhaustion isn't just about output. It's caused by the anxiety that defines self-worth based on constant, visible, excellent spectacles and performance. This leads to what sociologists term ontological insecurity, a profound sense of self-doubt tied to how productive and marketable we appear to be.
That profound anxiety is the shadow cast by relentless availability. Historical structures imposed a boundary on the ideology itself. Without the mandate of external control, the internal drive for productivity, which now fetishizes efficiency and even authenticity, has no ceiling. When society collectively agrees to take its foot off the accelerator, that provides a psychological floor.
And yet, we observe that even in countries like Germany or Poland, which retain stricter closure laws and a powerful cultural emphasis on Sunday rest, the digital and cultural pressure for performance remains intense. The individual still feels the pull of the global digital economy. This suggests that the internal, neurochemical demand for validation is the stronger force.
The difference is psychological protection. The Swiss cheesing of laws meant we lost the common, mandatory, empty time. We exchanged a collective, enforceable break for individual freedom. And the bitter irony is that we now feel guilty for exercising that very freedom, the freedom to do nothing. When every moment is available for market participation or self-optimization, the pursuit of happiness itself becomes the primary source of stress. The market, I reiterate, cannot be trusted to self-regulate rest.
And what I maintain is that the chemical and cultural environments of modernity have fundamentally broken the internal mechanism for rest. The structure of the market is simply responding to the structure of the brain. The true challenge is accepting that the quiet you seek must now be consciously manufactured from within. The world offers infinite stimuli. We must learn to be the boundary, demanding that we control ourselves, take only what we need from it.
It seems we agree on the diagnosis. We are tired, not necessarily because of the volume of our work, but because the culturally sanctioned, enforced off-switch is profoundly damaged. My argument is that the collective decision to dissolve structured rest exposed us to this relentless pressure. Rest requires not just permission, but insulation, a social structure that says, for a moment, this pursuit of productivity must cease.
And my conclusion is that the insulation must be internal now, as the external walls have crumbled. The first step toward recovering rest is accepting responsibility for managing our own input and retraining our brains to tolerate the magnificent, restorative experience of doing absolutely nothing.
A crucial insight remains, and it transcends our disagreement on causality. We must recognize the immense healing value of that historically mandated empty time. That time was not merely an absence of commerce. It was a presence of self. And perhaps the lost art we must recover is that ability to just sit intentionally without purpose or pressure.
So we invite you, our listener, to maybe try an experiment today. Set aside 15 minutes. Find a quiet space, put the phone out of reach, and just sit. No book, no plan, no purpose. Just experience the quiet. We'll be here next time to continue the debate.